here with my friend Dakota today.
Howdy.
Dakota is another boarder, which is how we met. And we want to talk about how expensive it is to have horses and how much it kind of sucks to be a broke horse person. Because you have also grown up kind of in a broke horse person.
I did backyard barns for a long time because there was no way I could afford to have a horse or to lease a horse. And then did some of like the working student stuff where I just worked god awful hours to be able to have like an hour-long lesson because it was like all my horse time.
Yeah, that was very similar for me. I mean, I started on my mom's farm, but then after that closed, I was doing the working student thing and just getting horse time wherever you possibly can.
As much as possible.
As much as possible, 100% of the time. Because horses are expensive.
So expensive.
And we both just bought our first horses in the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think we were within 6 months of each other.
I think so, yeah, because you bought Jules. And then I bought Scandal shortly after that.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is just for fun, what is the most shockingly expensive thing you've come across that you weren't anticipating?
I'm going to go with horse blankets.
Yes.
I don't know why I expected them to not be $300, but they are so much money.
Yeah.
For something that they wreck.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, wow, this is expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Or even not a nice horse blanket, like a rain sheet. I was like, wow, that's money.
Yeah.
There's no fill in this. Why?
Right. Yeah, no, literally. I remember Jules was having some fit issues because I was buying the cheaper end of blankets because I was like, ugh. And then
Smart Pack Ultimate's like so much money.
Yep. So that's the one that he has now because I was convinced to buy it and it was a really good investment.
Smart Pack, actually, speaking of Smart Pack, I had a horse blanket that got the waterproofing messed up and I assumed they'd want it back. And they were like, no, we'll just send you a new one. You can just keep it. If you can fix the waterproofing, great. Sell it, throw it away, do what you want.
That's amazing.
Same brand new blanket. They're like, January is like when we're shipping right now. Is that going to be okay or do you need it sooner? Because we can expedite it. And I was like, no, it's okay. Please don't expedite it. So
that's incredible.
Not sponsored by Smart Pack, but
no, but Smart Pack, you could. You could. Smart Pack could. This is a genuine review then. Did you also have the Smart Pack Ultimate blanket?
I do have Smart Pack Ultimate blankets.
Yeah.
Yep. I now own 3, including the messed up one.
Yeah.
So,
they're
worth
good.
It.
They're good.
10-year warranty.
Yeah.
So there you go. So there's it's expensive, but it's worth the investment.
Yep. I feel like when it comes to equipment, you kind of get what you pay for.
100%. You have to get the nicer equipment, which sucks.
Yes. Like when you're buying like a saddle and you're looking at the $6,000 price tag and you're like, is it worth it? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I know, because when I first I was like, hey, look, these saddles that I own I got for relatively inexpensive. And then my trainer was like, you shouldn't put those on that horse. And then I did, and she didn't like it, lo and behold. And then she was like, here's one that's a lot of money, but happier, so.
Yeah, I had a saddle that's been my saddle forever. That was actually one of my mom's students' saddles.
Okay.
So the saddle is older than I am, and it's like been well taken care of. And it has fit most of the horses that I've put it on well enough. You know what I mean? Like I wouldn't go and do like a 5-star event in it.
No, but like you could throw a half pad on there and like, it's okay.
Yeah, and it was like fine. And my heart broke when I threw it on Jules, and there was no world in which it was gonna fit even a little bit. I was like, oh no.
Yeah, I brought both mine to the barn, and I was like, could you please indicate which one of these to me I could use? And she was like,
none of the above.
You could put that one on for maybe like 2 times, but you should get a new saddle.
Yeah, and there's no working student option for a saddle.
No, you have to just buy it.
Mm-hmm.
Facebook Marketplace thankfully saved me in like Facebook groups. I can never say it right. Is it like Schleeze?
Please don't ask me this.
I don't know. Schleza? I don't know how to say it. Whatever.
We can
Google it.
We can ask Google.
Schleeze.
So you bought a Schleeze.
I did, yes. And it was a lot of money. And it took I had to go on Facebook and find one because there's no way I was buying one brand new. The price was just way too much. Found one on Facebook Marketplace. And then it was in Massachusetts. So I had to have a friend who happens to live in Mass. He drove 20, 30 minutes on his way home one time to pick this saddle up for me. Because I was like, please, I don't want to drive 3.5 hours, but I will. And now it doesn't fit great. It did. And now she has a top line.
Oh no. I was just reading an article that was like, don't bother fitting your horse for a saddle long term when they don't have a top line.
Yeah, I did get the saddle fitted. Thankfully, I can get it refitted because it's got like a metal tree, so it's fully adjustable, which is nice. But
I think that learning, like, I always knew that horses were expensive, but after buying Jules, and like when you're leasing a horse, you're probably spending, depending on the terms of your lease, somewhere between $150 and $800 a month. Like, I think there's a huge range.
I have to agree with that. I think when I first started leasing, but I was working for a lease for a while, when I paid for a lease, it was like maybe $350, $400 a month just to lease. That was reasonable.
Yeah, I was half leasing a horse for about that in like 2013.
Yeah, so it was much cheaper to do a half lease.
Yeah, and then the last pony that I leased was this cute little paint pony. And I think I was paying like $150 a month for her, but she was like kind of weird and quirky, which is like
fair enough.
My favorite type of horse is like a little weird and quirky. So it worked out, but it's harder to shop around for board, I think.
I agree.
Because you don't want to sacrifice quality.
Mm-hmm.
And so you are gonna end up paying probably somewhere in the range of like $15,000 to $20,000 a year on board alone.
100%, because you want a nice barn. You want your horse to be somewhere where you can be comfortable going away for 2 weeks and knowing that the horse is well cared for, it's fed, you're not worried about does it have a blanket on when it's raining out or, weather changes, but also so much money trying to figure that out.
And even working it off, like you're putting hours in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like at the barn, and that we both are benefiting from the generosity of the barn that we are at.
Yes, we both are very much benefiting. I know when I was in college, I benefited because I bought my horse in college, which was a choice and my mom was like, wow. And my dad was like, you are so dumb, but okay. But barn owner was definitely like way more generous to me than was probably like reasonable. It was like, here, you buy the horse and then I'll lease your horse that I know she couldn't use in lessons. It was like, you'll just pay a reduced rate just while you're in college. And there's no way I could have done it without that.
Yep.
No way.
Yep.
So
I think that's another like important thing is that the horse world kind of exists because of the barter economy that we have going on. I've had my pony my whole life.
Yep.
And when I was 12 or 13, so around when I was leasing this other horse, my pony was still living at my grandparents' place. And like, they were doing what grandparents do and getting a little older. And I felt really bad that like they were having to take care of the horses and like winter was coming up and it was kind of like a little bit of a conversation and it was like something has to change. And I just was like in tears talking to my barn owner at the time. And she was like, bring him here and we'll figure it out.
Right.
And it was amazing. Like she ended up using him in lessons. This like cute little kid leased him for a while and it was like incredible. She did not need to do that.
Right.
And it was above and beyond. And I think that like that generosity and kindness that is not common, but like is very much alive is like the reason why there can be broke horse girls.
Yes. I know my first full lease I did was at a friend's backyard barn. And this was when I was in college as well. And the woman who I was boarding at, we're going to say very lightly, she was like, the responsibilities that you have to come do AM or PM feed and cleaning every day. You have to pick which one, but then also provide your own hay, provide your own grain, and you don't have to pay board. So it was a big trade-off where I had to help as much as I possibly could, but she was like, I won't charge you board.
When I was working off the board and the lease effectively, I was at the barn like every single day doing something. And like that was also great because I was also helping exercise some horses in exchange for that, which was like crazy because that meant in my mind I was like, I'm getting more saddle time. This is incredible. I'm 13 years old. This is the best thing ever. And it kind of was.
Yeah. Like
I think that was probably like the most impactful part of my horse riding experience. And I think that is not uncommon because there are so many people who go after working student positions. My friend Maggie is a working student and loves it.
Right, because you do get a lot of opportunity to learn. I know the first barn I started taking lessons at, I did kind of working student. My dad also did some work for them since he's a contractor and they had stuff in their house that needed to be fixed. So we kind of did like a trade-off there. And when I would get the opportunity to help work other horses, I learned way more because I was trying different horses and seeing how they behave and learning new behaviors, which I think was so helpful.
Yeah.
And I think it's helped me now where I can be like, oh, okay, I've seen a horse do that before. But
Right.
also learning just to do more groundwork things with horses that, oh, we're not riding them, but they need to be lunged.
Well, and it's really interesting too, because I think it's really in the past, I'm going to say like 80 years that horses have vanished from most people's lives. We relied on horses for so much of human history. Like,
Right.
I'm going to get into this more in other episodes, but you can track human history
Right.
through horse history because they are so intertangled.
Right, because we needed them to plow fields. We needed them for transportation. They did everything for us.
Yep. We ate them. They
Yes.
were an incredible source of food when we were first starting, like, to learn how to farm.
Yep.
It's insane. And then very recently, like in the last episode we were talking about Tolkien, he had horses in his life when he was writing Lord of the Rings. They were everywhere.
They were, and everyone had them. It would be more weird not to have a horse
Yes.
than it would be to have a horse. Versus now you tell someone, oh, I have a horse, and they're like, what? You lease a horse? And
Right.
then you have to be like, no, I actually own one.
Right. Well, and I think that the assumptions that are made create some interesting conversations too, because I've definitely made a passing reference to the fact that I have a horse and had people just clock me as rich.
Yeah.
And
I'm
be like,
no.
Right. And be like, you must be wealthy. And like, well, granted, my family certainly does have like some money, and like I grew up privileged through that. Also, my parents were 20 when they had me, so they didn't have that money when I was a kid doing horse things. Like, it's just interesting because then and it feels like weird. It feels like you have to qualify it because you're like, wait, no, I'm not that kind of horse person.
And also, I think for me, because I'm 22, so I think where I'm younger, people automatically like, oh, your parents pay for it. And I have to be like,
Yes.
no, I do it all. And they're like, well, your parents probably do something. And sure, they get me like Christmas presents where they're like, look, a saddle pad. Or my dad did get me one of the Smart Pack Ultimate blankets one year. But the automatic thing is like, oh, yes, like your parents pay for it or your parents help you. And I was like, no, I do it.
Right. Well, and it's really interesting that you say that because the only reason I have my horse is through my family.
Yeah.
Like, my mom gave me Jules, and my grandmother does pay the portion of my board that I don't work off.
Right.
So, like, I'm paying for his vet and his farrier and his equipment costs, but I couldn't afford him on my own.
And I can only afford to have a horse on my own because of, one, the barn owner, who allows me to just work so much so that I can work off board. But then also through, I was raised to have a job since I was like 15. I got like a worker's permit thing that you can get. I worked for so long that I had great savings. And so then when I was like, oh, I could actually afford to buy a horse, and trying to do like all these spreadsheets and like lay out the costs of if I could actually afford it or not, I was like, I guess I can.
I think also horses have become so much more expensive in the last like 15 years.
They really have.
It's kind of insane. When I was showing just schooling events, I was paying $75 for a non-recognized 3-phase. I don't know if that exists anymore.
I don't think so.
Like,
I don't show for a reason.
Well, and so
it's so much money.
And in order to be taken, quote, seriously, you need to show.
Yeah.
Which is so interesting that we put the value where you have to spend the most money.
Absolutely. And also, if you don't have as much money, like I did not come from a family with a lot of money. I didn't come from a family that could ever afford to have horses at home or own a horse for that sake, right? They were like, do you show? And I was like, I can't afford that part of it. But when you don't come from money, you can't work up the levels. You can't show as much. You can't really do as much. The opportunities become pretty limited when you can't afford to do, like, oh, I can't show 5 times a year minimum. I haven't shown in, I don't know, since I was in high school, I think.
Yeah, I haven't shown since I was going into my sophomore year of high school.
Right, because it's so much money. But then people are like, oh, well, what do you do then if you don't show?
Right.
Like,
well, and even
why do I have to show my horse for it to matter?
Right, exactly. And even people inside of the community, I feel like there is some judgment about not showing. And I think that there is some judgment about if you choose just to do like trail riding.
Yeah.
Because that is seen as the cheaper option.
Or even if you choose to have a horse and not want to ride them because you don't have to ride your horse. Like owning a horse is not about riding them. It's about owning a horse. It's a pet.
Right.
It's not,
right.
It's not, oh, this is a vehicle for me now, because that's not the world we live in. And so I think there's also that judgment too when I tell people like, oh, I don't ride my horse that much. I do ride my horse, but not that much.
I mean, one of my goals for this winter is to not do a whole lot of real work, because Jules and I had been doing a bunch of real work for like a few months, and he was really in it with me. And then we had one lesson where he just wasn't. Yeah. And he was like, I need a break. So we're just taking a break. And it's like, fine. Because also partially because I'm not showing. I'm not worried about him being in shape for the summer. It's time to go and do the serious thing. But I think I'm thinking about it. And there's a really important qualifier on this conversation, which is that you and I both ride English. Primarily.
We do both ride English.
And you know what's more affordable? Western shows.
100%.
And you know what's really looked down on? Western shows.
Yes.
Which is so interesting.
It is weird the way that dynamic works.
Uh-huh. It is. It really is. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that the discipline that comes from military training and largely white nations, English riding, is what is the thing that is taken seriously versus Western riding, which really started in the United States with indigenous and Mexican populations, the good old cowboy, and that's what's like not taken as seriously.
Right. Like I feel like a lot of times when I get into the discussion of riding horses, someone asks me, oh, so do you do like dressage? Do you do show jumping? It's never, do you do barrel racing? It's never that. It's always assumed, oh, you ride English, which I do.
Yep.
But it's always the assumption is you ride English.
Especially in New England.
100%.
Which is really white.
Very white.
And wealthy.
Yes. And on that same note, a lot of the more expensive, flashy, showy barns in New England particularly are English, for sure. And more of the people who do backyard horse riding tend to ride more Western.
Yep.
But they're still not taken as seriously just because they don't board at a big fancy barn. And that's okay. They don't have to. But
I think one thing that people say is like, oh, well, like, have you seen those barrel racers starfishing on their horses? And I'm like, yeah, have you seen the dressage riders with blood in their horse's mouth? Like, there's problems everywhere.
Exactly.
There are terrible riders on both sides, and there are amazing riders on both sides. Like, some of the riders who I have seen the most in the wild that I've just been floored by are Western riders. Like, I feel like a lot of Western riders have a grace and a composure in their riding that dressage riders could really learn a thing or two from.
I think there also tends to be more of this focus in Western getting off the horse when you're like noticing the horse is not in it, versus English riding. I feel like you tend to notice more people being like, oh, I'm just going to push through that. I think it's interesting, that kind of swap where there's not that either side obviously has the goods and the bads. But I always think it's so interesting. At my first barn, they did it was a good mix of Western and English riding. And we would have clinics where it'd be primarily English, and we'd have clinics where it'd be primarily Western. And I learned a lot more with the Western clinics because they would do more, don't get on the horse. A lot of times there'd be, you can put your saddle on your horse, but you're not going to get on that horse today. We're going to learn pretty basic groundwork right now, work on some stuff with your horse. And when your horse is ready, you can get on that horse. And if it's not ready in a week, oh well.
I do agree that I think I've seen a lot more Western riders be willing to get off and be like, what's wrong? Like, what's happening? And I think that it's probably because, at least in some part, because Western isn't taken as, quote, seriously. I think there's a little bit more freedom in it. Whereas, like, I think that if you're riding English, there's like this expectation, especially if you're a dressage rider, there's an expectation of like excellence all of the time.
You're always perfect and you always are uniform and nothing goes wrong ever.
Yes. Versus, like, what do we see celebrating Western riding? Rodeos, gymkhana, stuff that is like fun and like engaging in different ways. Reining horses? Oh my God. I could watch reiners all day long. I think it's so cool. Like, I want to learn how to ride a reining horse so bad. And like, I cannot even imagine the seat you have
Yeah.
after that.
100%. That's how I feel about watching barrel racers. I'm like, that horse is like almost sideways and you are stuck on. I'm like, that is impressive.
Which is partially the equipment.
Yes.
Like, that's why a lot of people like to start horses in Western saddles, is because they hold you in a bit better, especially barrel saddles.
Yeah, they're huge. They're way more.
They are. And they just like, you've got literally the horn and like the seat comes up behind you, and you do feel more secure in a Western saddle. When I'm riding mostly trails, I'm typically doing a little winglish and I'm in a Western saddle.
Right.
But still, there's this very cool video that you can find very easily, I'm sure, if you Google it, of a reining horse and a dressage horse. And they do this whole little routine together, and you see them do the same movements, just in the two different...
I've seen that.
It's so cool. And then they swap horses.
Right.
And it's really interesting to see. It genuinely takes the dressage rider longer to resituate than it does the reining rider.
I have seen that. I think it's so interesting watching that, where they switch.
Yeah.
And then the reining rider is he's just figured it out.
Right. He's like, oh, okay, I sit on the horse.
Right. I sit on the horse and I do the thing.
And I think that there's a lot more encouragement of kind of figuring it out.
Yeah.
Like I was just reading this thing today, actually, which was about English riding, interestingly. But it was talking about how there has been this change in the way that lessons kind of go, where there are fewer instructors that are on the horses with the kids. And it's mostly people are standing and watching and telling you from the ground. And how this person in particular learned to ride was, there was like 10 minutes in the ring. You like check your equipment and you like do your stuff. And I can't remember who this rider is, and I don't know anything about them. So I'm not speaking to their ethics or anything like that. This is really specifically about this thing. And then they would go out and do these rides where they would go on trails and like go and do all these different things. And you just learned as you went. Yeah. And I've talked about before, I think that the reason that I have most of the skills I have is because I spent most of my childhood riding in a river and like going on trail rides into the middle of nowhere. And I think that is also becoming less and less common as horses become more and more expensive, which is really sad because people don't want their horses to break.
Right. Because if you have to pay the vet bill, if something happens to the horse, it's so much more money.
And as an instructor or as an owner of a facility, you don't want somebody getting hurt on your property because lawsuits are becoming more and more prevalent.
Yeah, I mean, even signing a waiver doesn't necessarily protect you, which I think is scary for barn owners. You can sign that waiver that says that if something happens, you're not gonna, come after the barn owner, but that doesn't mean people don't do that anyway.
Right, and even if the case gets dismissed, that barn is still having to pay the expense for their lawyer responding to that. And that's a lot of money too. That's a lot of money too. And there are all of these pieces that just didn't exist before this was a recreational sport.
Right.
Because it is recreational now. It's not a tool, it's not a necessity. It is a luxury item.
It is a luxury. Yeah, I mean, if something happens, I feel like horses are generally the first thing. You're like, well, I'm not gonna have that anymore.
Guess that's gone.
Right. That's too much money now.
Darn it.
Yeah.
And I think that there are obviously some people who are like, no, I would scrimp and scrounge other places before I let go of my horse, which is also fair. But I think that for most people, absolutely, if you lost your job or hit a hard spot, like the horse probably is one of the first things to go.
Yeah, because unfortunately, it's a very unpredictable expense too, where you never know what's going to happen. Maybe, like my horse, knock on wood, has traditionally been very inexpensive with vet bills. And in the beginning, when I first bought her, I had to do x-rays for kissing spine and determine if we were going to do injections or if we could just do chiropractic stuff. And that ended up working fine. I got a chiropractor and red light therapy and all that fun stuff. And she's not as bothered by that. She's like one segment of kissing spine, and it doesn't bother her as much anymore. But when I first got her, that was a new expense. I was like, oh man, this could end up being a long-term thing where I'm having to put a lot of money into this. And that wasn't an accidental injury. That was just she just has it.
Just the way she is.
It's just the way she is. It's not going to go away.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where like the scary stuff comes in for people with horses, is it's so unpredictable if they're going to do something, especially if you treat them like glass. Like they're automatically going to get hurt if you do something with them.
It is insane that we spend so much money on these animals. And it's also insane that they cost so much when we relied on them so much a generation ago.
Yeah.
Well, and there still are so many working horses too.
There are. Yeah.
And I think it's so funny. My family's gone to the Sandwich Fair like every year for like my entire life. We always watch the horse pulling because it's So much fun. I love watching the horses pull. And you can always tell which horses are actually used as workhorses versus which horses are explicitly trained for this one thing. One year we went, and it was this one girl who was like solid, but was probably like 160 pounds.
Okay.
Like a smaller girl, rock solid, like clearly worked on a farm. And she had these two massive Belgians.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just her. And like the other horses around her had teams of like 2 or 3 people. Like one person was dropping the hitch while the other person was holding the horses or something like that. And these horses were like revving to go and like having to be physically held back while they dropped the hitch.
Yep.
This girl, nope. Her horses very calmly walked up. She dropped the hitch. They waited for her command and then they went and she said stop and they stopped.
Yeah, I was at the Cumberland Fair this year. We were watching the horse pulls and there's like a outdoor area where there's fences and you can like wait for your turn to go in.
Yep.
And I remember seeing a bunch of people like having to have one person holding each horse and like the horses were like kind of flipping out. And there was this one cowboy who like walked up with these gigantic horses and just dropped the leads. He just dropped and then he walked away. And he didn't come back for like 10 minutes. And these horses, they just stood there. They didn't go anywhere. They didn't do anything. They just stood there.
Yeah.
And then when it was their turn, he just came back, you know, grabbed onto them and they just walked right in and were so calm about it. While all the other horses around them were very worked up about what was going on. It was like, oh, okay. They do that a lot.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting to think about because, I mean, this summer I was taking Jules for trail rides and I was sent this really funny picture of me texting on him. And it was Kate who sent it to me. And I was like, how many 5-year-olds can you text on? And she was like, not many that aren't ranch broke at 2. And I was like, yep. Like, that's kind of it. I think that this is probably a topic for another episode. But I think it's really interesting to think about the differences between horses that are used for pleasure and horses that are used for work. Because there are a lot of huge differences between them. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's like a lot that they could learn from each other. But I think that a lot of the pleasure horses could learn more from the work horses.
I agree. I mean, there's also like the financial difference there too between owning a horse as a work horse versus owning a horse for pleasure. But also I think that when you have less money and you put time and effort into a horse, I feel like you tend to emotionally connect with that a little better and you tend to be more invested. Like I could never ride my horse again. And never be upset about that. Maybe be a little upset, right? Because it's fun.
Upset. Mine's 5. I'd be a little upset if I could never ride him
mine's
again.
10, right? So like I'd be upset, but I'd keep her.
Yes.
I would not get rid of her. I would still do things with her. It just would be things on the ground. And even though maybe I wouldn't like that as much, I would still keep her.
Yep.
And I think that there's also this thing where like people who have money, not all of them, some of them, will say, oh, I can't ride that horse. Even if it's a fixable problem, right?
Sometimes we're going to trade it in for the next model up.
Yeah, almost like trading in a car. I always think that's so interesting, is like that dynamic there, where people who, generally speaking, I don't want there to be like this like overarching, I'm categorizing people because I'm not, because there's always outliers. Generally speaking, when people have more money, they're less invested in the horse because it's just money for them. They don't have to put as much work and time versus like, I work for my horse. I work to have her.
Right. I mean, this is a silly comparison, but parking tickets are just parking fees for wealthy people.
Yes. I am not going to park incorrectly because I don't want to pay that.
Right.
It's not just inconvenient. It's like, oh man, that's $75 that I could have bought groceries for the next 2 weeks with.
Right. Well, I think you hit on something really key there, which is convenience.
Yes.
And I think that's the difference. Like, it would be way more convenient for my goals. I want to get my bronze medal. It would be way more convenient for me to sell Jules and buy a $50,000 made horse.
Yeah. I would I would love to be able to compete in like more shows and do more things and not necessarily climb the ladder because I don't really want to do that, but show more and be more present in that side of the horse community. But I don't have money for that.
I think it's ostracizing in some ways to not be able to show too, because you are being kind of left out.
Right, because you can't pay that much money. You can't pay, I mean, the entry fee alone, right?
Let alone the hauling there. You're probably paying $2 to $4 a mile to get there, and a hitching fee, and you're paying for your coach to be there for the day if you're lucky enough to have a coach.
Right. And if you have a coach, you're paying for sometimes it's paying not just for your coach to get in with you, depending on what it is, but also paying for your coach to teach you while you're there and help you warm up. And that's a lot.
It's a lot of money. And again, like speaking specifically to English riding, that is where people are taken the most seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Part of why I want my bronze medal is kind of like a, yes, I can. You know, like I have always been the rider growing up who has been broke. Like I did shows a lot when I was a little kid, but I haven't for a while.
Yeah.
And I took dressage lessons, and when I was the best at dressage, I was not showing. Right. I was riding this one horse with my instructor, and I really felt it when I talked to people that they didn't believe me.
Yeah. That
I really was able to do the things that I was saying. And I was like, no, you don't understand. This instructor wouldn't let me look at her horse if I couldn't do it right. Like, I swear to God, I'm telling the truth, but I wasn't showing, and I don't have medals.
Your ability to show a horse does not judge your worth as a horse person.
Right.
It just, maybe you just are more wealthy.
Right. And ability does not necessarily mean skill. Like, ability means literally your ability to afford the situation. Right, your ability
to afford it. I also think, too, when you go to a show, if you appear more of a broke horse person, right? Because we've all seen the people at shows who it's like, oh my God, you have so much going on and there's a lot of money there. And you can tell.
You know which horse is going to win in the warm-up ring.
Yes, you do. Because you're like, oh my God, I don't want to think about how much money you paid for that horse. Versus a horse that you can tell, oh, okay, like this is, you know, they board somewhere maybe, but this is more of a broke horse person. I feel like there's this judgment there too when you go.
Right, you've got the backyard oopsie grade horse versus your imported Dutch warm blood, and you're like, well,
and
obviously
flew in from France, and
right, you're like, well, obviously one of these horses kind of has an innate advantage. And also we talk about, like, there's a joke that like men spontaneously appear in the upper level. Like when you go to the barn, what you see is women, and then when you look at the Olympics, what you see is men, and you're like, whoa, what?
How did that happen?
And this is a much bigger conversation, which I hope to have in another episode. But I think part of it comes from men are taught to do things that are financially viable.
Yes.
And discouraged from having hobbies.
Yeah. I mean, I think out of all the boarders at our barn, there's one man that I can think of. And he doesn't ride. He just comes to see his horse.
Yeah, and it's his kid's horse. It's wild. It's wild.
Right. We have a lot of horses. There's like, I don't know, like 30 horses.
There's a lot of horses on their barn. And if you include lesson students and stuff, you're probably looking at like 50 or 60 people.
Exactly. And I don't see many lesson kids that are boys.
Nope.
I very rarely see, I can think of the one son that comes to ride and he does lessons, but otherwise not really. Which I just think is so interesting.
It is. So maybe I'll have you back and we can talk about that another time. But for now, thank you so much for coming and chatting with me about being a broke horse person.
That's great.
It requires a team.
Yes.
Requires a support network.
You have to be a broke horse person to know broke horse people and be like, I get it.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'll talk to you later.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us this week at the Horse Girl Gazetteer. You can find us online at Horse Girl Gazetteer on Facebook or Instagram, and Horse Girl Gazette on TikTok and Patreon. You can also email us questions or comments at horsegirlgazetteer@gmail.com. If you find yourself enjoying our content, please leave us a review and share the link with your friends to help them find their way to us. We appreciate any and all support. Talk to you later.